Right, okay, let's think about and start talking about the experience of air raids and bombing during both wars, First World War, Second World War. First World War sees the first ever example of aerial bombardment on the home front on Britain. And this shocked the British people tremendously. They'd never experienced anything like this before. And the things that were actually delivering the bombs, these huge airships, hydrogen-filled airships, Zeppelins, were monstrous things in people's eyes. They were absolutely dreadful things that could arrive, flying at such an altitude that British planes could not meet them and shoot them down. There was little we could do to defend ourselves against them, apart from make sure that the town was blacked out. They were truly dreadful things, and they caused an enormous amount of panic, and it appeared that the government could do little to combat them. They first appeared in 1915, and for a year or so they have great success in terrifying the British public. They're not carrying a huge amount of bombs. They're not destroying whole streets or whole neighbourhoods. They can destroy a house. Their main impact, perhaps, is a psychological one. The British people have never seen anything like this before, and they feel defenceless against this new form of warfare. However, into the war, it's 1916, 1917, the British are developing their defences. Searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and if you can find one of these giant things in the sky, they are relatively easy to shoot down because they are highly flammable. So after about the early part of 1917, the Germans are losing so many of their Zeppelins that they cease using them. They then replace them. Let me just show you a picture of them. Should be familiar with this sheet. That's the Zeppelin. They replace the Zeppelin with the Gotha bomber. This can carry a much greater payload of bombs, and for a while, again, they have a huge amount of success. There's little we can do to stop them flying over, until later on in the war we have more success in our anti-aircraft guns, and our planes begin to shoot them down again in quite considerable numbers, and it becomes too dangerous for the Germans to send them over. They're losing so many planes that the campaign is unsustainable. So eventually that campaign is terminated in 1917. If we look at the effect of aerial bombardment during the First World War, the casualties are relatively small. We're talking about, perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 people being killed over the 4-year period. So that's relatively minimal compared to what will come later. However, the big impact is the psychological one. Civilians are faced with the threat and danger of being killed in their own homes, and we can't overstress how important and how significant that was at the time. Okay, that's the First World War. If we jump forward 20 years to the Second World War, and the big fear by 1939, the year war breaks out, is that the bomber will always get through. Advances in technology meant that bombers could fly further. The Germans, of course, are now much closer. They've taken over France in 1940, and so they can now reach any of the major British cities. So it's not just a London phenomenon, it's now London's under attack, Manchester, Birmingham, Coventry, Bristol, Plymouth, as far north as Glasgow, as far west as Belfast. So the whole of the UK is now the front line, if you were. How does Britain respond to this? Again, a blackout is enforced. And in the first month or so of the war, many people are injured on the roads because the cars don't have headlights, there's no street lights, so there's a huge rise in the amount of traffic accidents. By the time the bombing actually starts, this doesn't start until the fall of France, after the fall of France, so we're talking about September 1940, the British have a highly developed civil defence programme, a series of shelters. You've got the famous Anderson shelters given to people to build in their own back garden for a small fee, and if you don't have the money, they're given away for nothing. And about 500,000 of these are sited in homes in the southeast of England. This is fine if you have a house, if you have a garden, in fact. Another form of shelter is given to the general population, which is the Morrison shelter, this cage-like structure which goes inside your house, perhaps underneath the stairs, and gives you some protection in the event of bombing. If a bomb hits a house, everyone inside the house is going to die. But these give you some defence against falling masonry, falling timbers, etc. However, the vast majority of people don't stay at home during an air raid. They go to public shelters. And in London, people gravitated towards the London Underground system, this massive network of tubes under London. At first, the government is very reluctant to allow people to use the Underground as a bomb shelter, but gradually public pressure forces them to open up the station so that people could shelter there for the night. And thousands of Londoners do just that. The Blitz is so called because it's a contraction of the German word Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The main period of bombing is this 9-month period from September 1940 to the middle of 1941. The Germans don't lose interest, they carry on bombing for the rest of the war, but their main focus becomes the Russian front, so the intense bombing campaign perhaps lessens during 1941. And this lull is followed, of course, in 1944 by the use of the vengeance weapons, the V weapons by Hitler. The war turns against him by 1944, and he has devoted a huge amount of money and material and technology to build the world's first missile systems, if you like. And in 1944, London is hit with a second blitz, if you like, when the V1, the Doodlebug or the flying bomb, is sent over to London, and then later the even more destructive, the world's first true guided missile, the V2, is sent over in 44 and 45. And so the blitz resumes in London. How do we compare the bombing campaigns of the First World War to the Second World War? The First World War is much more small scale. You know, we're talking about people dying in the low thousands. The Second World War, we're talking of over 50,000 deaths and casualties, and thousands upon thousands of homes destroyed. This is the great period of the so-called Blitz spirit, which people associate with this guy, of course, who you're all familiar with, Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister from 40 to 45. And he embodies this so-called Blitz spirit, which is standing up to Hitler and the Nazis in the face of this terrible adversity, the bombing of their home cities. Does it exist? Some people would suggest yes, it did. People did stick up and withstood an enormous amount of fear and terror, and there was a sense of community. We're all in this together. We can defeat the enemy if we do work together. Other people will suggest that perhaps this myth is a creation, perhaps, of government propaganda. And some people felt that they were taking the burden of the bombing, particularly if they lived in the East End of London, compared to those who were wealthier who lived in the West. So be aware that there is this idea of the Blitz spirit. Does it really exist? If we're comparing the First World War to the Second World War, the bombing tonnage is much greater during the Second World War. The destruction is much greater. The deaths are much greater. The spread of the bombing is much wider. It's over the whole of the UK. Have a look at this sheet. Kind of gives you loads and loads of things on the Blitz and on how Britain coped with aerial bombardment during both wars. Okay.